Now for a rare view of the Israel-Hamas war from an Israeli infantryman. Sam Sank is a British Israeli whose period of service has just ended. In normal life, he works in information technology. For his months of fighting in Gaza, he carried a small video camera, and special correspondent Malcolm Brabant sat down with him in London.
This is the video diary of the soldier behind the officer on point.
Together with my brothers in arms, we're part of history. This will probably be a very significant event in the history of the Middle East, let alone Israel.
Master Sergeant Sam Sank.
It's also good for the world to see as well, and it shows, you know, the true experience of a soldier on the front line, and maybe shows a different side to what one sees through propaganda or social media as soldiers. And actually, as you can see now, I'm a real person with real emotion and real thoughts. Yeah, yesterday was awful. This place stinks. Smell of dead bodies everywhere. Not a great start.
Sam Sank went to war on October the 7th, immediately after the terrorist attack by Hamas. After training in northern Israel with his company, or Pluga, Sank entered Gaza several weeks into the conflict.
We have just entered Gaza
And spent nearly 2 months there.
Here we go. Here we go. Yesterday was a really bad day. 2 guys from our Pluga got injured, one quite seriously. Was in a helicopter to the hospital. Both were shot in the back. Man, 2 secs. Just gonna check out this pier.
As second in command of his platoon, Sank ventures forward to examine the entrance of a Hamas tunnel beneath Khan Yunis, once home to 250,000 Palestinians.
Gaza is arguably one of the most dense places in the world, and Hamas has decided to use that as a battlefield and to use human shields to protect themselves and to put all the civilians above the ground and all their ammunitions and terrorists below the ground. Got this pier, rats. A few Israeli soldiers were killed at that specific spot. So after weeks of fighting, we were able to locate the tunnel entrances.
People who are watching that might think that you were cheering Palestinians' homes being blown up.
So the context of that video is the tunnel being destroyed, and for us it was a sense of achievement knowing that we had killed Hamas terrorists that were still hiding underneath, and we had eliminated a big threat to our soldiers' lives. We're in central Khan Yunis, eastern central Khan Yunis, in a new house. I'm sitting here on guard duty with my main man Leshem. Here you can see close to a big mosque, very urban area. This is going to be our new home for the next few days. But feeling good, you know, liking the new area.
Sank's war is over. He's returned to his civilian job in IT and now has time to reflect. How can you justify all those thousands of women and children being killed during this conflict?
I don't think I can justify the numbers, but I can explain why that's happened. We are dealing with an organization that has decided to put civilians at the forefront of their bases, of their battlefield. Boker Tov, welcome to southern Khan Yunis. We're in a house. Look at the lovely Jerusalem decorations on the wall. Arrived here yesterday. Crazy dissonance coming in to a more urban area like this was insane, honestly, at night. Going through the city, seeing the destroyed buildings.
Do you think there might have been a better way of fighting this war to really more accurately target those people who were responsible for starting it?
I think if there was a better way of doing it, then it would have been done, because I trust in the strategic command of the IDF in Israel to make the best decision to protect its soldiers and to protect the Palestinian civilians as much as possible.
Do you feel as though Israel has fallen into a trap created by Hamas because they knew that Israel would come in and in the end, if it kept going, would end up perhaps losing world opinion?
Yes, for sure. Hamas set the trap up. It's the ploy that Hamas and other terrorist Palestinian organizations have been using for many years. Unfortunately, Israel doesn't have a choice and has to move into that trap, because if, again, we want to defeat the enemy, destroy the terrorists, and bring our people back, we have to go into Gaza. The world, as I see it, will always be against Israel in this conflict. There is an underlying anti-Semitism that exists. This is just our generation's persecution of Jews.
Hopefully we'll be a couple quiet days before we're eventually supposed to leave. Final Shabbat in Gaza. Can't wait to go home. Can't believe how long it's been. I'm just counting down the hours, literally. Everyone's making fun of me, but I'm counting down the hours, but I'm desperate for this all to be over. Just want to get back to normal life.
Do you think you could ever live side by side with Palestinians?
100%. You look at conflicts that have existed over the history of the world, people that hated each other with a passion and are now living together in peace. Whether I think it will be a happy peace, maybe not, but even a cold peace is better than what exists today. And yes, I truly believe that it can happen. And if the Palestinians love their children more than they hate ours, there will be peace. If they start celebrating life rather than celebrating death, there will be peace.
For now, such a peace remains in the realm of dreams, despite suggestions that progress is being made. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Malcolm Brabant.
Hello guys, welcome to a new edition of React Today as part of the World's Web project. What do you think about the last video? Does Israel really want to have peace and make peace? Or is Israel the center of all problems in the world right now? I mean, if you're talking about peace, Israel cannot happen. As long as Israel is in conflict with the occupation, I never called this a war. A war is when there's equal or similar forces with armies, air force, naval forces, etc., fighting each other. This is an occupation for more than 100 years. Designed more than 100 years. This is ecstasy for Israel, of course. That's why they call it the 9/11 of Israel, because it is the opportunity for Israel to occupy, not only intellectually, with the trades, everything they do. I mean, in the editorials, in mainstream media, in platforms, in order for us to communicate each other, are nothing but monopolies owned by Jewish people. That is why they were hated in the Second World War. That is why they are still hated. The fact that two presidents of two different universities have to be removed from their positions because so was the will of the donors speaks loud to me, like very loud, about and how the influence of Israel is so heavy and so capable of corruption, to corrupt institutions, to corrupt mainstream media, and not only Israel lobby, but tobacco, Pfizer, Pharma, of course, and all those lobbyists. So when we see this declaration of this soldier, we need to understand this, that Israel has a lot of influence. The government of the United States, for example, is corrupt to the core. They depend on their careers, and their careers as politicians are supported since 2014 and a little before, when it is against the First Amendment to say that you cannot give $1 billion to a campaign of your candidate or for the candidate of your preference. And And that couldn't be happening because that means that the regular voter cannot influence the party the way big donors do. And since then, and I'm talking about 40 years ago with Thatcher, and I'll mention that 100 times, and Reagan, but 40 years later, the consequences are degrading the planet, degrading the economies, and imposing by force whatever the super rich and the elites of the most powerful countries in the world through contracts of war and destruction. The imposition, their laws, and the taking over of resources of other countries, and call that a new world order or new rules-based order, whatever you can call it, whatever, as long as the policy is always the same, which is we come, we see, he's dead.
So, I mean, that is the land of unconfirmed.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, I'm sure it did.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We look now at how Palestinians are being increasingly targeted by U.S. anti-terrorism laws amidst ongoing efforts to conflate pro-Palestinian activism with so-called terrorism. The Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, has called on university presidents to investigate Students for Justice in Palestine, known as SJP chapters, for, quote, material support for terrorism. ADL CEO Jonathan Greenblatt has even compared SJP to the Hitler Youth.
Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And the SJP and these kids who are pushing it are like the Hitler Youth. Sorry, I know people don't like it when I say that, but it's true. And what Shai said before is spot on.
Meanwhile, several American universities have suspended or banned Students for Justice in Palestine. In an interview in January with CNN's Dana Bash, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi claimed without evidence some protesters demanding a ceasefire in Gaza are connected to Russia and urged the FBI to investigate them.
But for them to call for a ceasefire is Mr. Putin's message. Mr. Putin's message. Make no mistake, this is directly connected to what he would like to see. Same thing with Ukraine. It's about Putin's message. I think some of these protesters are spontaneous and organic and sincere. Some, I think, are connected to Russia. And I say that having looked at this for a long time now, as you know.
You think some of these protests are Russian plants?
I don't think they're plants. I think some financing should be investigated. And I want to ask the FBI to investigate that.
She later would say when people were protesting in San Francisco, go back to China. For more, we're joined by two guests who've been following all of this closely. Darl Lee is an anthropologist and lawyer teaching at University of Chicago. He's the author of the new briefing paper, Anti-Palestinian at the Core, The Origins and Growing Dangers of U.S. Anti-Terrorism Law, jointly published with the Center for Constitutional Rights and Palestine Legal. And we're joined by Dima Khalidi, founder and director of Palestine Legal. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Darl Lee, let's start with you. Talk about what you found.
Good morning, Amy. It's good to be with you. Well, I think many viewers of Democracy Now! Are probably familiar with the way that Palestinians have been slandered and stereotyped as terrorists for a long time. What this report does is it reaches back and connects the dots of a longer history, going back almost 50 years, showing how the very foundations of terrorism law in the United States at key moments of their development were crafted with the agenda of opposing or crushing Palestinian liberation in mind. The first time the word terrorism even shows up in federal law is in a 1969 statute, and it's unfortunately very relevant today. This statute restricts U.S. aid to UNRWA, the UN body that provides humanitarian aid to refugees, and it uses the word terrorism essentially as a synonym for Palestinian resistance. And one of the chief sponsors of this legislation, Congressman Leonard Farbstein from New York, made a speech on the floor of the House of Representatives where he peddled the stereotype of UNRWA schools and Palestinian refugee camps essentially as hotbeds of terrorism that are brainwashing the sort of next generation of terrorists. So in light of today's campaigns to defund UNRWA and to deprive Palestinians of humanitarian aid, we can see that this is part of a much, much longer campaign that extends in many different directions.
Can you talk about who is pushing these laws and what their agenda is, Darl Lee?
Yes, one of the other key aspects of the story is the role of organizations like the Anti-Defamation League in pushing for this legislation over time. And again, this is relevant for one of the clips that you just played, the clip of Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the ADL, accusing student activist SJP of being terrorism supporters. There's a bit of a coming full circle moment here, because the ADL was actually one of the organizations that lobbied very heavily for the passage of this law that criminalizes so-called material support to terrorist organizations. The material support statute is actually the most commonly used charge in federal terrorism cases. And the reason why it's prosecutors' favorite tool is because it is incredibly broad. It criminalizes ordinary activity that would usually be covered and protected by the First Amendment. So it's a very, very convenient weapon. And it was passed in the 1990s as the result of a long-running campaign by the ADL and other groups to essentially crack down on Palestinian community organizing and Palestinian solidarity organizing in the United States. And what they did actually was they exploited the outrage following the 1995 bombing of a federal building in Oklahoma City. Now, many people will recall, of course, that the people who carried out that bombing were U.S. citizens, essentially right-wing white nationalist militia members. But the law that was passed as a result of the Oklahoma City bombing included, it was mostly a sort of get tough on crime, crack down on immigration bill that included the material support law that was proposed by the ADL as part of a larger package of measures that were all about essentially targeting Palestinian liberation movements.
And Dima Khalidi, head of Palestine Legal, let's be clear, it's not only Students for Justice in Palestine that have been banned on some campuses, but also Jewish Voice for Peace.
That's right, Amy. We've seen over the last several months multiple efforts to shut down student activism, and that is a direct result of efforts by groups like the ADL, but also by statements by President Biden himself that have said that he is mobilizing federal law enforcement to surveil campus activism. And these threats of surveillance that Pelosi herself made as well are serious, and they reflect what we are saying in this report is a fundamentally anti-Palestinian agenda. When the U.S. government, instead of stopping military aid to Israel to stop this genocide, is stopping funding for UNRWA, that is a lifeline for Gazans. This is the result of decades of anti-Palestinian rhetoric that has allowed these laws to develop, and that is ultimately, in this moment when people are mobilizing to stop this genocide, a cover for the genocide. It is a justification for the dehumanization of Palestinians and their allies, to tar them with criminal or discriminatory intent. And that's the intention of this report, is to really expose this anti-Palestinian agenda that is driving efforts to really expand these laws to target First Amendment activity that is trying to mobilize people for justice.
Palestine Legal has received multiple reports of the FBI harassing Palestine advocates for their social media posts. Can you describe some examples, Dima?
Well, we and other legal organizations that are supporting people who are facing increasing repression are getting multiple reports of people being visited by the FBI. Often because of social media posts that they make, because of their activism on the streets. And people have even been visited by ICE, immigration enforcement agencies. And this is a direct result, again, of this rhetoric, of this increase in surveillance resources to law enforcement agencies. And as we know from the post-9/11 era, the impact on our communities is enormous. It has a huge chilling effect on people, on First Amendment rights, but it also is a signal of an erosion of a whole host of constitutional rights when law enforcement is mobilized in this way, as we saw in the 1960s with COINTELPRO, as we saw in the post 9/11 era. So this is just the beginning, we think, of what is a massive mobilization of state resources against this movement. And this is why we're publishing this report now, to really encourage lawmakers to protect First Amendment rights, to roll back these laws which are only shielding Israel from accountability and scrutiny and undermining fundamental First Amendment rights for everybody.
Can you talk about the anti-Palestinian bills that are in front of Congress? And one of them that would possibly radically expand deportations of Palestinians at this time, Dima?
Yeah, we're seeing legislatures around the country, not just Congress, but state legislatures threatening, presenting bills that are trying to justify an erosion of constitutional rights and First Amendment rights by noting terrorism, supposed terrorism threats, right? And certainly after October 7th, we saw an increase in these kinds of bills, one that wanted to deport all Palestinians. And we see this rhetoric from our elected officials as well. So we are very clear that the reason that this is allowed to happen is because this anti-Palestinian sentiment has been cemented not only into U.S. law, but into the minds of people. And that's why these kinds of bills are proposed with hardly anyone blinking an eye.
We came, we see he's dead, so Hillary Clinton.
So, I mean, that is the land of unconfirmed.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, I'm sure it did.
While Libya was being destroyed, having fun, and the people in those countries, like in any other country where the United States have any influence, for protecting Israel in the Middle East, its result is nothing but devastation, destruction, etc. Take a look at Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. We have mentioned before the influence of BRICS. So what do other people think? What other governments think? Let's hear from other of the countries that, apart from South Africa, has had the guts to tell it as it is and call it as it is. And the ambassador to Israel from Colombia, who said to the UN, and she went to the International Court of Justice, actually. Well, she is actually represented and represents the Colombian ambassador to the United Nations against Israel. And when Israel came to call the ambassador of Colombia in Israel, hey, come here, and bitch on her. Well, the president of the country, Colombia, in South America, said, if you want to break relations with us, sure. If it's necessary for us Colombians to break relations with you, Israel, goodbye, au revoir. Hasta pronto, hasta nunca, hasta siempre. And this is the declaration of her ambassador to the problem in the occupation of Israel against Gaza.
Mr. President, members of the court, it is a great honor for me to address the court on behalf of the Republic of Colombia in these proceedings. Our presence here today bears witness to Colombia's tradition of respect for international law, but it also reflects Colombia's deep concern about the incidents that regularly occur between the State of Palestine and the State of Israel, exacerbated after the horrific events taking place since 7th October 2023, which have unleashed a cycle of violence that has only worsened an already calamitous situation, causing the death of more than 27,000 civilians and thousands of wounded. Colombia rejects any recourse to violence or unilateral acts that lead to a higher level of confrontation. We also believe that holding states accountable for violating international law, especially when their actions bring about dire humanitarian consequences, is a sign of respect for the rule of law. Colombia has expressed before and reiterates today that the occupation of the Palestinian territory is a violation of international law and is contrary to the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. Furthermore, as the court itself stated in the construction of a wall opinion, it is clear that both Israel and Palestine have the obligation to abide by international law and to respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law within the occupied Palestinian territory. Both states also need to implement in good faith all relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. Additionally, Colombia fully shares the court's view in its advisory opinion on the construction of a wall to the effect that the United Nations and the General Assembly in particular need to redouble efforts to encourage a negotiated solution to the outstanding problems on the basis of international law and with the purpose of the establishment of a fully viable Palestinian state existing side by side with Israel and its neighbors, fostering peace and security in the region.
Moralize us.
Canadian citizens are worried about themselves and where we're going. We too have drones. Not only the police here, not only the authoritative government of Justin Trudeau.
Making your will to survive, to fight, and to thrive despite what happens in the world. Because living a long life where you sell out, where you're under mind control, I don't think it's a great thing. But living the life.
So when you see this, we can add other comments regarding this matter and try to find out who is right and who is wrong. Because in this case, we need to identify who's right and who's wrong. And when we see this,
Al Jazeera is reporting Israeli forces in Gaza have killed at least 11 people who are waiting for aid in Gaza City. More than 20 injured people were taken to Al-Shifa Hospital. Health officials in Gaza say Israeli forces have killed more than 400 aid seekers in Gaza in recent weeks. This comes as Israel continues to restrict aid coming into Gaza, which is on the brink of famine. The UN is reporting one truck was recently denied access to Gaza because it contains scissors inside medical kits. UNRWA head Philippe Lazzarini criticized the decision, saying, quote, medical scissors are now added to a long list of banned items the Israeli authorities classify as for dual use. He went on to write, quote, the list includes basic and life-saving items from anesthetics, solar lights, oxygen cylinders and ventilators, water cleaning tablets, cancer medicines, and maternity kits, he said. Meanwhile, an aid ship bound for Gaza has set sail from Cyprus with 200 tons of food supplies. The UAE-funded mission was organized by the two aid groups, World Central Kitchen and Open Arms. Inside Gaza, Palestinians marked the first day of Ramadan on Monday.
The first day of Ramadan is very tough. We don't know what we're going to cook. What are we going to have for iftar, the meal breaking the fast? Also, at suhoor, the meal before the fast at dawn, we couldn't cook. There's no gas. We get out of the tent in the cold to light the fire, and it's really cold. How are we going to cook? Also, the prices are unimaginable. Prices of the tomato and the potatoes. The prices are high. We can't get meat or chicken. Everything is very expensive. In this situation, we don't want aid. What we want is a ceasefire.
On Monday, senior U.S. intelligence officials testified before Congress. The Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, warned the war in Gaza will increase the threat of terrorism for years.
Moreover, the crisis has galvanized violence by a range of actors around the world, and while it is too early to tell, it is likely that the Gaza conflict will have a generational impact on terrorism.
The Guardian is reporting 12 prominent Israeli human rights organizations have signed an open letter accusing Israel of failing to abide by the ruling of the International Court of Justice to facilitate more humanitarian aid into Gaza. In the letter, the groups wrote, quote, "The ICJ order is a legal obligation to end the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. It must be abided by, not only to ease the urgent suffering of civilians, but for the sake of humanity as a whole," they wrote. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, has accused the Israeli military of beating and waterboarding some of its staff held in Israeli prisons. UNRWA states in a new report, quote, "Agency staff members have been subject to threats and coercion by the Israeli authorities while in detention and pressured to make false statements against the agency, including that the agency has affiliations with Hamas and that UNRWA staff members took part in the 7 October 2023 atrocities," unquote. UNRWA has faced a crisis ever since Israel accused a number of its staff workers of taking part in the October 7th attacks. Although Israel did not share evidence backing up its claim, many countries, including the United States, cut off funding to UNRWA despite Gaza's catastrophic humanitarian crisis. In recent days, Sweden and Canada resumed funding.
And we see that
on Hamas, let me explain this complication. Firstly, the policy of the ANC and government has always been that we support a two-state solution, that Israel and Palestine should be two nation states living side by side in peace and security. In the final analysis, however, what eventually obtains will be determined by the people of Palestine, right? Very, very important that we recognize that. Just as we determine the course of our own history, we must allow Palestinian people to do the same.
what would you like to say? That Israel is right and that it has the right to be protected by all countries because they are the elect people? Did you forget about the separation of state and religion? Did you forget why in many courts in the United States and Europe, "In God we trust" has been taken down from the courthouse? It's not only because it's anathema or they want to get rid of the power of God or God's justice, which we haven't seen, but because it was necessary to separate the state from the religion, because they cannot live together, especially in the Western tradition. There's values from the Greeks, not only from the Catholic Church and the Judeo-Christian, as everybody wants to tell you. If it wasn't for the Catholic Church, there wouldn't be any values in the world. That is a lie. The values of understanding between peoples, hence.
Where, after all, do universal human rights begin?
After World War II, it was clear that the horrors of the war should never be allowed to occur again. Founded in 1945, the United Nations sought to prevent future atrocities by affirming, in its foundational charter, faith in fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of the human person, and a commitment to promote better standards of life in larger freedom. In the years that followed, member states of the United Nations strived to develop the human rights provisions of the Charter and capture them in a single document. It took 3 years to agree on a common vision. On the 10th of December, 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations.
Still, it is the first step in a great evolutionary process. It is the first occasion on which the organised community of nations has made a declaration of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and it has the authority of the body of opinion of the United Nations as a whole. And millions of people, men and women and children all over the world, will turn for hope and guidance and inspiration to this document.
While history alone can determine the historic significance of an event, it is safe to say that the declaration before us may be destined to occupy an honorable place in the procession of positive landmarks in human history.
The Declaration consists of a preamble and 30 articles, with Article 1 powerfully proclaiming that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. No discrimination, right to life, liberty and security, no slavery, no torture or cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, equal protection of the law, no arbitrary arrest, detention or exile, fair and public hearing, no arbitrary interference with privacy, right to freedom of movement, right to seek and enjoy asylum, right to a nationality, right to marry and to found a family, right to property, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of peaceful assembly and association, right to take part in government, right to work, right to rest and leisure, right to food, clothing, housing, medical care and social services, right to education, right to participate in cultural life.
These human rights are not country-specific. They are not a reward for good behavior or particular to a certain era or social group. They are the rights of people of every color, from every race and ethnic group, whether or not they have disabilities, citizens or migrants, no matter their sex, their class, their caste, their creed, their age, or sexual orientation.
The Declaration has generated action for human rights protection in many ways. It has inspired hundreds of human rights instruments that together constitute international human rights law and a number of international bodies and mechanisms for human rights protection. The principles of the Declaration have supported the decolonization struggle and have been enshrined in the constitutions of the newly established countries which have joined the United Nations. The Declaration has inspired national and regional human rights protection systems, including legislation and institutions. And it continues to guide the work of human rights defenders and advocates worldwide. Today, the Declaration is available in more than 500 languages and dialects, and it has obtained the Guinness World Record for the most translated document in the world. The 10th of December, the day on which the Declaration was adopted, is celebrated each year as Human Rights Day. The Declaration emphasizes the relevance of human rights in our daily lives.
Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world.
Freedom to Canada!
And I'll finish with that by repeating it. Here's how they control us, and love is how we win. Thank you.
As you can see, this is a peaceful meeting, as always. We're fighting for our rights.
Thank you so much, Sherry Strong.
Whatever it takes.
And I know
Remember,
I'm halfway through 1984, but I know
peaceful
love
revolutions,
is the biggest spoiler for their
not violent
plans,
revolutions.
and it's the biggest heightener of our lives. So please live with more love and do more things that invoke
those who
more
make
love in your
peaceful
life.
revolutions impossible only make violent revolutions inevitable.
That
was John F. Kennedy. It was paraphrased
33
also
years, a father of two,
the leader
raised on
of
a
the
farm,
human rights
growing up in poverty, learned to value
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
hard work, self-employed, finding prosperity in oil.
The problem is with the Catholic Church and the evangelicals is that they don't want to admit that they took a lot from the Greeks and a lot from the Romans over the years, because it was common sense, and it was not only common sense, but it was what it was applied in their communities as a civilization. If we understand the Greeks as a civilization, what's going on. So for those evangelicals and Catholics that without understanding, without discernment, just abiding by the Pope and the Bishop and the priest, whatever they say you have to call and kill Iran because we say so. Why is that? No, because Iran is helping the enemies, our enemies, and is destroying. Look, yeah, but they don't think on themselves. They investigate. They don't research. They don't do anything like that. They don't want to read because they just want to be followers. In many cases, because people work and they have to make money and support their families. But not only that, it's because self-inflicted ignorance, which is a very dangerous point, or willingly self-inflicted ignorance, which is just to oppose for opposing itself, without reasoning, without arguments, in order to say, I'm going to discuss this point with Federico or with whomever. That is where Catholic Church, Evangelical Church is taking us, in the name of Israel, not in the name of God, in the name of Genesis 12. If you see my program in Spanish, biblically, I speak biblically, you can put the CC, go to auto translation, and after you go to auto translation, just pick the language you want. It's not going to be 100% accurate, but I think it's kind of, might understand my points, even though I'm going to produce an edition for English language, because it's necessary. I think that Canadians and Europeans need to know the biblical part of the argument of Benjamin Netanyahu, that according to my beliefs and research, doesn't go along with the Catholic and the evangelical understanding of Genesis 12 and of the rest of the promises to Israel, that if you oppose Israel, you will be crushed. That's according to Catholics and evangelicals, which are very dangerous right now because they're supporting a genocide. And as long as it doesn't happen to you, who gives a shit, eh? Okay, so let's watch this one.
We have technology that we can see exactly who's in these locations and buildings. So they're targeting and bombing homes, knowing who and how many children were actually inside. My name is Josephine Gilbo. I'm a 17-year Army veteran. I recently got out of the military last year. Having that background as an intelligence officer and understanding what defense actually is, I can see clearly that this is not self-defense. The civilian casualties is catastrophic. They're targeting homes filled with children. The elite that sit in Capitol Hill sit there and lie over and over and over. I just want to highlight one of the biggest awakenings that I think I've had the last few weeks coming here and lobbying with the senators and the congressmen is just how corrupt our government is. And that anyone that's in the military is simply just one chess piece that they use at their leisure for their own internal gain to protect their own internal assets and money.
And I will end by saying that don't do unto others what you don't want to be done unto you. I heard that from Colonel Scott Ritter. I think that he took it from me on my discourse of December the 9th, 2023, in which I experienced myself.
Where, after all, do universal human rights begin?
After World War II, it was clear that the horrors of the war should never be allowed to occur again. Founded in 1945, the United Nations sought to prevent future atrocities by affirming, in its foundational charter, faith in fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of the human person, and a commitment to promote better standards of life in larger freedom.
Now we're going to speak about today about the pandemic and the effects of the World Health Organization and what's going on with the World Health Organization and why the World Health Organization, through the international health regulations, as we have spoken for a long time here, nobody's paying attention to it. I tried to talk to Richard Wolff, I tried to talk to many journalists in order to give me the chance to make an interview to them. I will make of it interesting, as you followers of this program know, will be an interesting review and interview. But none of them, maybe because I only have 58 subscribers, don't dare to speak with the army of one. An army of one, in this case, it is I. It is me. It is I who is the army of one. I hope that more than 58 army of ones come together and destroy what is against us, because we're fighting uphill. On last Saturday, there was a protest in the city where we wanted to have been interviewed. We needed to be interviewed by CTV or by the CBC or by whatever and whomever that is interested in what international health regulations are mandates are doing with the help of the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization will have the power to shut up 8 billion people again all around the world if it pleases her. If she said there is an emergency of immediate contention that we need to declare in this region, it's going to spread all around the world. It's 10 times or 100 times or 1,000 times infectious than COVID-19. Everybody's going to die if you don't get vaccinated. So Alan Dershowitz and all the systems that were applied on experiment 201 that gave amazing results, especially hundreds of billions of dollars to the pharmaceuticals, especially Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, and I forget one. They made billions of dollars on the years of the pandemic that submitted us and 8 billion people around the world through remote control, through the platforms that we use on a regular basis as independent media, in order to tell us that we couldn't go out. I went out in order at the university to find out if I had the infection. I was tested positive, but didn't take anything for it. I didn't get the vaccination at the University of Alberta. I just didn't get vaccinated. The court in Canada has found that us, the people that did not vaccinate themselves, were right. And not only that, a judge recently failed against the Emergencies Act, taken over by the government, the liberal government, it's supposed to be liberal, in order to seize the accounts of people that contributed to the truckers. I made a video about it, more than one. It's called From Vancouver to Ottawa, in which I explain how legally it is against the Constitution and Article 7 of the Constitution, and against the Bill of Rights and Freedoms of Canadians. So check it out. The point is, now that it's unconstitutional and has been approved by that and has been appealed by Chrystia Freeland, of course, and the Liberal government, those fraudsters, I mean, I compared these people with the people in India that hack on your account and steal the money of the people and do whatever all they want. That's what they want to us legally. now with Bill C-63. If you say something against the interest of America and Israel, which are not the interests of Canadians, Americans, or Israelis, except for Israel, the Zionist movement. Those guys are okay with what's going on with the occupation and the genocide, sure. The majority of people in Israel, yeah. Many of them are moving to the United States, to New York, buying property, and because they are afraid that Israel might be attacked and destroyed, literally. Which will be the only position that will take Israel to the ground with Palestinians in order to make peace. They talk about the two-state solution for decades. They've been still talking about the two-state solution. I don't think so. I don't agree with that. I think that the only way for the Israelis and the Palestinians to live together is if they live under the commandment of God, which is living peace together. That's it. Don't do unto whatever you want to be done unto you. That means before Israel in the Zionist plan 100 years ago with the Balfour Declaration decided that only Jews, especially Zionist Jews, that means rich Jews that have accumulated over the centuries brute capitals, monopolizing as always the roots and the diamonds, the gold mines, you name it, rare earths, aluminum, and whatever resources it's all about, but mainstream media, press, editorials, you name it. And you only can do that if you have reincarnated. If you reincarnate in a planet like this, you know what your goals are more clearly. Because you reincarnate and you say, oh yeah, this is the goal. That is the Talmud. What is the Talmud is all about? Is to remember Jews that they own the world and the rest of us are to bend over and get fucked by them no matter how many times. And that's it. And if they want to come and get our house for which we worked for decades, they can do that because they're the elect people of God. And if they want to commit Amalek against United States, Canada, England, Norway, Switzerland, Sweden, Russia, they will do because they're the elect people, and we have to just bend over, get fucked, and give them our land and our children because they are the elect people of God. If you do believe that such a blasphemy, you have to see the biblical part, because I did in Spanish and I'm going to do in English for English speaking people. But you need to understand that I literally do not agree with that point of view, in which Israel is the saint people that is getting back to the obscurantism, that is not remembering that there's a separation between church and state, that is not remembering that there's international law and there is international agreements, and the United Nations was created after the League of Nations. The League of Nations was created in 1920 after the Sykes-Picot Agreement was distributing all the Arabic riches, Syria and Iraq, to get the oil from Syria and Iraq on their mandates. Iraq for Britain, Syria for the French, and Palestine for the Jews. Of course, the Rothschilds. Oh yeah, they were coming with big capital, so why not? So let's spread the wealth between the few and let the millions of Arabic people kill each other and don't commit to them whatsoever. And America and the United States at the beginning was not part of the League of Nations. It didn't want to take part of it. It was too important for themselves. After the Second World War, they created United Nations, which is a stronger grip of the Israel-American. I want you to understand that in my point of view, it is Israel who governs America. It's not the other way around. If you see who is the president now, it's not Biden. It's Antony Blinken. And all of them confess themselves to be pro-Zionist, pro-Israel. No matter what Israel do, they can come and kill and tell me that they're going to kill all the Americans because they are the elect people of the world. And even the Christian evangelicals will abide by them. They will never discern that telling, hey, you're going to have to kill your brother, your sister, and your parents because it is written now. And they will go against your parents, father against son, mother against daughter, and vice versa. And that's what is happening. And this is the pleasure of Satan. This is ecstasy for Israel, because the point is, right now, the world is in such an unbalanced situation that not even the wobbling and the rotation and the translation of our world and the climate change is going to be enough to stop what Israel is doing against us, the country, and the world. In the name of God, a God that I haven't seen, because the God I have seen from them is nothing but evil. Evil. The same with America and the UK for the last 500 years. I know that America is not as old as Yale, whatever. The point is, America, Ukraine, UK, and Europe are not governed by people. Those continents are not democratic, are Satanists on the way they behave, because this cannot be the gospel. And if there's countries that deserve to receive the Amalek vision of Israel, is Israel, the United States, the UK, and the 27 countries that are for this genocide, and whoever is for this genocide around the world.
Alright guys, so today we're here at the corner of 120, 185 and 20 Stony Plain on CTV premises, because we are protesting about what?
We're protesting our alignment with the WHO pandemic treaty here in Canada. So we understand that there's a deadline as of mid-May that the pandemic treaty has to be signed on to by the G7 countries. So what that essentially means is that the WHO, in the event of another pandemic happening, will be calling all of the shots regarding the pandemic response. This is going to be affecting lockdowns, vaccine mandates, and so on. So where we saw during COVID, each jurisdiction was responsible to make its own pandemic response, the WHO will be calling the shots. So if you believe that our constitutional rights were violated during the first pandemic, just wait and see what will happen once the G7 countries sign on to this treaty.
We already know that a court here in Alberta and Canada is in favor. Hey, my man, how's it going?
Oh, you got a camera going?
Yeah.
Doing a broadcast?
Yeah.
Awesome, brother.
We need to document this for the rest of Canadians.
Awesome.
Just like you guys do. Okay, so the problem is that we're going to lose sovereignty. That's what people are afraid of.
Yes, yes.
Most Canadians don't believe that that's going to happen. Sovereignty? What are you talking about sovereignty loss here? What do you mean by lose sovereignty?
Well, we saw the suspension of our constitutional rights during the pandemic, and they said that it was in order to protect people. So I think, you know, when an organization, an unelected, a non-government organization is calling the shots, they are not going to be thinking about people's personal sovereignty, the importance of preserving our rights. They're going to violate our rights and say it's for our own protection.
Exactly. What we heard and we lived on the last pandemic was exactly that. The taking over of our rights, the immobilization of 8 billion people around the world, closed them up, and now they're going to do it again. So what you're saying is, if the World Health Organization gets in gear and is approved on the 27th of May this year, their mandates are going to be above the constitution of Canadians and all the members of the World Health Organization.
Right, the governments will be compelled to follow whatever directives come from the World Health Organization under penalty of law, under penalty of international law.
So that's not going to be a suggestion anymore, as the international health regulations suggested before, but a mandate. It's going to be mandatory for all nations to comply with.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so you Canadians, according to the testimony that we have here, what do you think about this? Are you going to manifest yourself? Are you going to protest? Or are you just going to still be at home doing nothing, thinking nothing, not protesting? Something else you want to add to the document here?
You know, get out there. We take our power back when we share information with each other, when we talk about what's actually affecting our country. Don't be afraid to feel uncomfortable. It is so important for these conversations to take place.
Thank you very much.
I hope we're still on.
So, what is Canada doing about it, contributing to the thing? Oh, I have to say that the government of Canada just a few days ago decided to lift the sanctions to UNRWA, United Nations Assistance Program to the Palestinians, because for some reason they thought it was too much. So they want to look good, and elections are coming, so the liberals want to look good with the people. They need the votes, so do the conservatives. When you see this kind of manifestations, public manifestations, which are constituted in the charts of rights and freedoms of Canadians, and again in the Constitution that I have read for you many times, 2-3 years ago, when all this began, and the fact that the judge has failed in favor of us, the country and the world, and declared unconstitutional the enactment of the Emergencies Act, which is only can be applied in case of national calamity, like we are under attack, for example, or like there's a catastrophe of national security, like going to war, or there's a tremor, or 7 or 8 Richter scale, the earthquake. Then you can say something like that is go coast to coast or attacked by different countries. Sure, you can enact the Emergencies Act. But for girls and boys with families dancing on inflatable happy times in winter time, -30, minus whatever, honking the honks and saying, hey, these mandates are unnecessary. We already have the vaccine, but we are against the mandates.
Unjustified, unreasonable, unconstitutional. A federal judge has ruled that the Liberal government's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act in response to the Ottawa convoy protest violated the charter. It was a lengthy ruling published today that acknowledged the protests in the nation's capital and across the country caused harm to the economy, trade, and commerce. However, they did not rise to the level of a threat to national security as defined by the law. If you haven't guessed it already, Trudeau's government is set to appeal the decision. Federal Court Justice Richard Mosley found the situation created by the protests in Ottawa did not meet the threshold to invoke the Emergencies Act.
This is a peaceful protest!
Rather than Prime Minister Trudeau facing the cameras today,
we do not agree with this decision, and respectfully, we will be appealing it.
Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland provided the government's response.
We believed we were doing something necessary and something legal at the time.
In early 2022, thousands of angry protesters descended on Ottawa to make their frustrations known about the pandemic response and vaccine requirements. They blocked border points in Windsor and in Alberta, and protesters in the nation's capital parked trucks and large vehicles within key arteries of the city for nearly a month, honking their horns for days on end. Then on February 14th, 2022, for the first time in Canada's history, Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act to allow the federal government to use powers like giving police additional avenues to arrest protesters, go after financial support tied to the protest, and one of the most controversial, the freezing of participants' bank accounts.
The police will be given more tools to restore order in places where public assemblies can constitute illegal and dangerous activities.
We were convinced at the time, I was convinced at the time, it was the right thing to do.
But that wasn't good enough for the federal judge who wrote, quote, I have concluded that the decision to issue the proclamation does not bear the hallmarks of reasonableness, justification, transparency, and intelligibility, and was not justified in relation to the relevant factual and legal constraints that were required to be taken into consideration.
Our national security was under real threat, our national security, including our economic security. That was the reality of that moment. We explored many, many avenues to bring this to an end. This was an option of the last resort. We believed at the time.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre reacting to the news on X today. He's putting the blame on the Prime Minister, saying he caused the crisis by dividing people. Then he violated charter rights to illegally suppress citizens. As PM, I will unite our country for freedom.
The reason we were in that crisis
was a direct failure of Justin Trudeau's leadership and also other levels of government that failed to act to take the challenge presented seriously. Their inaction resulted in a serious crisis where we reluctantly supported the invocation of the emergencies measures. We said that was something that we reluctantly supported.
The Emergencies Act defines a national emergency as a temporary, urgent, and critical situation that seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians and is of such proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it.
As our Minister of Justice has said, we will, confident in that belief, be appealing this decision. Thank you very much. Thank you.
The decision by the federal government to appeal today's ruling sets up a legal battle that could go all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. While there's no cost ramification for the government, the political impact could be staggering. The case was brought forward in part by the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and I'm joined tonight by the Executive Director, Noah Mendelsohn-Aviv. Noah, this is a huge victory for the CCLA. What message does this send to the Canadian people tonight?
It's a huge victory for the Canadian people who care about rights and freedoms, because without checks and balances on the power of government, any one of those rights or freedoms can be taken away. And that was what concerned us. And that's why we said the government cannot invoke emergency powers unless there is truly a national emergency. And this victory for Canada, for democracy, said what happened in Ottawa, as difficult as it was, as much as it needed to be addressed, that was not a national emergency. It did not justify using emergency powers.
It was found that the Liberals exceeded their powers, but for the average Canadian who looked at the chaos in Ottawa at the time, police didn't seem to be doing much for weeks on end. The province wasn't anywhere to be found to handle the situation. So what other options were there for the federal government?
I mean, ultimately, the blockades and the disruption in Ottawa, including, impacts on marginalized and vulnerable communities, which had to be addressed, all of that was handled through policing. Ultimately, it took will, and it took it took will to get it done, and that's what they did. The detail of how the protest was dismantled, how the disruption was ended, and how Ottawa was put back to rights, because there was unlawful disruptive protest, and there was legitimate protest as well, and it was all going on together. Ultimately, it was a policing issue that had to be addressed by police, and that is what took place. Emergency powers were not necessary, and that is what the federal government said today as well. And the dangers of using emergency powers is what CCLA and so many other people were concerned about.
The Liberals have been swift to say they are appealing. I'm sure you've already been discussing Chrystia Freeland's statement today. So what is next for the Civil Liberties Association?
Well, I mean, we're going to consider our next steps, but I think it's fairly safe to say that this is a very important issue for us, for CCLA, for all of Canada, for everybody who cares about their rights and freedoms. And we're going to continue to push it because it is critical that this and any future government, whoever they may be, whatever their political stripe, understands that they cannot give themselves massive powers unless it is truly necessary. There is a true threat to national security across the country that ordinary laws cannot handle, and the federal court found on evidence that was not the case.
Thank you for your time tonight, Noah, and all the best.
Thank you.
That's what the international health regulations and the World Health Organization are trying to get, and what these manifestations are against. And that is, this time they're going to go in more subtle with the language, where the international health regulations, amendments on Articles 19, 16, 20, 21, and many others, become, because the international health regulations are the legal part of the World Health Organization's assembly, which is the one that has the representatives of the different countries of the world, 194 and 193, in which they come together and say, sure, whatever you say, we abide to. That means that this we will abide to is legal and it's binding. It's not anymore a suggestion. And the language that is being used by the international health regulations amendments are that this is not suggestions any longer, I said again, but that everybody needs to comply. That means that not only the member states, but the authorities of those member states all around the world have to impose by force, with dogs, with police, that you put the vaccine this time no matter what. Alan Dershowitz style, George Floyd style, I say it for the end time in my programs since the pandemic began. If you don't want to be aware of that, it's because you're stupid. And that can happen to us. I used to believe that Israel was awesome. I loved Israel when I was growing up. Holy, yeah. As a Catholic, of course, I was educated to love Israel. And I was educated to obey the gospel and to obey God and to obey the priest and to obey the hierarchy from the Pope down. Not anymore. I don't believe I've been an evangelical. I have been in there, involved in there. I have studied the evangelical view for years. I have studied the Srimad Bhagavatam, the Bhagavad Gita, whatever. Even when I was 13 years old, which I was not unfamiliar for me because I was a good hypnotist. Yeah, hypnotist. When I was 13 years old, I have the record actually for hypnotizing a guy in 30 seconds and putting him between two chairs in the neck and in his Achilles. And he stood straight. I was 13 years old, just brand new 13 years old. So I know what I'm talking about. I'm familiar with the phenomena. So when I found out what Israel is doing, I cannot do anything. I cannot watch a movie. I cannot go running. I cannot stay home. I can see the sun, beautiful here in Canada. See wonderful place this country is. The same in Europe, the Nordic countries, and everywhere in the world. And I cannot stop thinking about the occupation in Palestine and what Israel is doing in the name of God, my God, the Christian God, the Muslim God, and every God. And I see the mainstream media supporting it. It's causing me trauma. It's causing me pain. It's causing me discomfort. And the fact that the United States is an accomplice with the United Kingdom is something that I cannot stop but thinking about. I don't know what to think about this, so I invite you to have a good time and consider what I just saying and vote for me the next election so we can have an alternative to the Liberals, Conservatives, NDP, or the Greens. I think we need a new party because we need something definitive in Canada. And I'm not going to get the support from the Canadians themselves unless they promise and they take part of reality as the Canadian New Party is proposing, so that we can build this country from the down up. We meet in the middle. Of course, the super rich in Canada don't want that. Chrystia Freeland and all these people, the WEF guys, the WEF puppets, where this German guy keeps on petting. Freeland, and Freeland. Freeland. Well, Slaveland, I will say, Slaveland.
My name is Julie Panesi, and this message is about mandatory vaccinations. I am a professor of ethics at Huron College at the University of Western Ontario. It's one of the largest universities in Canada. Today, I'm going to teach you a short lesson on the universally accepted ethics of coercing people into medical procedures. I'll be the example. My employer has just mandated that I must get a vaccine for COVID-19. If I want to keep working at my job as a professor, I have to take this vaccine. Here's my conundrum. My school employs me to be an authority on the subject of ethics. I hold a PhD in ethics and ancient philosophy. And I'm here to tell you it's ethically wrong to coerce someone to take a vaccine. If it happens to you, you don't have to do it. If you don't want a COVID vaccine, don't take one. End of discussion. It's your own business. But that is not the approach of the University of Western Ontario, which has suddenly required that I be vaccinated immediately or not report for work. So with the school year beginning in a few days, I am facing imminent dismissal after 20 years on the job, because I will not submit to having an experimental vaccine injected into my body. I've had plenty of vaccines in my life, but I've never been forced to take one. It's always been my choice. I don't work in a high-risk environment. I'm not a doctor in an emergency room. I'm a teacher. I'm a university professor. My job is to teach students how to think critically, to ask questions that might expose a false argument. Questions like, says who? Who is the authority giving this order? Should I trust them with control over my body? As a professor, I don't have to watch the news to find out if the COVID vaccines are safe. I read medical journals, and I consult my colleagues who are professors of science and medicine. I've learned from doctors that there are serious questions about how safe these vaccines really are. There are questions about how well they work. Nobody's promising that I won't get COVID or transmit COVID if I get the vaccine. But ultimately, none of that matters to me, because I'm a professor of ethics and I'm a Canadian. I'm entitled to make choices about what does and does not enter my body, regardless of my reasons. If I'm allowed back into my university, it's my job to teach my students that this is wrong. I'm hired to teach them that it is ethically wrong to impose an experimental medical procedure as a condition of employment. This is my first and potentially my last lesson of the year. Ethics 101. In the spirit of Socrates, who was executed for asking questions, this lesson will consist of only one question. The answer is multiple choice. Please listen carefully. When a person has done the same job to the satisfaction of her employer for 20 years, is it right or is it wrong to suddenly demand that they submit to an unnecessary medical procedure in order to keep their job? In this case, the procedure is an injection of a substance that has not been fully tested for safety. It has not yet been shown to be effective. It is designed to prevent an illness that poses little threat to the employee. The employee is not allowed to ask questions. She may only submit to the procedure or be fired. To my first-year students, is this right or is this wrong? I already know the answer.
That was amazing, Julie.
Sorry. Sorry.
And Trudeau and all these people with Bill C-11, Bill C-18, and Bill C-63, it's just unacceptable. For us, for the country, for the world. Hope to see you next time in the next edition of React Today as part of the World's Way Out project. We'll make a chapter on the World's Way Out project pretty soon. Or bye-bye, something.